Okay, hi everyone, welcome back. So we'd like to start the third panel, please. The third panel is entitled Specific Acts, and we have 5 excellent speakers. We'll have an exciting panel on different aspects of the genocide. We're going to start with Professor Maryam Jamshidi. Professor Jamshidi is an associate professor of law at the University of Colorado Law School, where she teaches and writes about international law, national security law, and tort law. She received her JD from the University of Pennsylvania, a master's degree in political theory from the London School of Economics, and an undergraduate degree from Brown University. Professor Jamshidi is a member of the Middle East Studies Association's Committee on Academic Freedom and its Civil Rights Task Force, a board member of UNRWA USA, and a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Please help me welcome Professor Jamshidi.
Hello. So, the core rules of international humanitarian law that protect civilians and civilian objects during armed conflict are vital. They have helped shift the laws of war away from their earlier focus on the military needs of states and towards their current predominant focus on protecting civilians and civilian objects from the scourges of war. In Israel's case, the systematic evisceration and disregard of these core rules is at the heart of its genocide against the Palestinian people. Because the civilian protection rules of IHL don't just attempt to shield civilians from war's destructive force. They also provide a crucial safeguard that prevents belligerents from using the fog of war as an excuse to perpetrate the crime of crimes, genocide. So I'll begin by briefly laying out IHL's 4 core civilian protection rules. I'll then describe a few of Israel's patterns of conduct and policies that underscore its flagrant and consistent violation of those rules. So there are several principles at the heart of the IHL regime for protecting civilians and civilian objects from harm. The principle of distinction, the principle of military necessity, the principle of proportionality, and the principle of humanity. These 4 rules have the status of customary international law, which means they are binding on all states, including Israel. Starting with the principle of distinction. According to this rule, parties to a conflict shall at all times distinguish between civilian and military objectives and shall direct their operations only against military objectives. What this basically means is that you can't target civilians or civilian structures. Where there is any doubt as to whether a person or object is civilian, civilian status has to be accorded. Now, there are 2 primary ways in which belligerents can violate the principle of distinction, either by engaging in attacks that are indiscriminate or by deliberately targeting civilians or civilian objects. An indiscriminate attack is an attack that was not directed at a specific military objective or that could not by its very nature be directed at or have its effects restricted to such targets. A deliberate attack is different. It involves the intent or purpose to harm civilian persons or things. The next core principle of civilian protection is the principle of military necessity. According to this principle, belligerents can only apply that amount and kind of force against military objectives, which includes combatants, that is necessary to realizing their military goals. Now, even though states have flexibility in setting those goals, that flexibility isn't limitless. For example, actions that are unlawful under international law, like genocide, can't be pursued. States can also only pursue those military aims that are lawful under the UN Charter, which basically restricts a state's armed actions to those necessary to its self-defense. Because the self-defense right only gives states a limited right to defend against immediate or imminent threats, the principle of military necessity probably doesn't allow a state to pursue its adversary's total and complete destruction. The third core principle is the principle of proportionality, which has been described as the central pillar for civilian protection. Under this principle, attacks against military objectives that are expected to cause excessive losses to civilians or civilian objects as compared to the concrete or direct military advantage that would result from an attack are prohibited. What this means is that in conducting each and every attack against a military objective, belligerents are obligated to assess whether incidental harm to civilians or civilian objects is likely, and if so, whether that harm is expected to be excessive as compared to the military gain from the specific attack in question. Sorry, can you just push play because it looks like it stopped? Sorry. The last core principle for civilian protection is the principle of humanity. This principle requires belligerents to adopt precautions to protect civilians and civilian objects from harm. This means doing things like taking feasible steps to ensure attacks are directed only at military objectives. It involves adopting means of attack that avoid or at least minimize incidental losses to civilians and civilian objects. It means refraining from attacks that are likely to be disproportionate. It also means, where possible, providing advance warnings to civilians of attacks that may affect them. There is ample evidence Israel has systematically and deliberately violated all four of these principles of civilian protection. Now, generally, to assess violations of IHL, we look to each discrete incident and evaluate whether the actions taken were lawful. In the situation of Gaza, that analysis, which various human rights organizations have already conducted and are continuing to conduct, has and will continue to show innumerable discrete IHL violations by the Israeli government. But what is particularly striking about Israel's nearly 20-month onslaught is the litany of policies and patterns of conduct that clearly demonstrate Israel's widespread disregard and manipulation of the four core IHL principles. These principles, these policies, these patterns paint a startling picture of Israel's military strategy in Gaza. That strategy is one that depends upon the holistic dismantling of IHL's civilian protection rules in order to destroy, depopulate, and eviscerate the conditions of life necessary to the Palestinian people's survival. Let's start with the pattern of destruction Israel has pursued in Gaza. Since October 7th, Israel has directly killed more than 53,000 Palestinians, according to the very conservative estimates of the Gaza Ministry of Health. This figure includes over 16,000 children. The actual death toll in Gaza is likely much higher, perhaps even double the total figure from the ministry. Indirect deaths caused by malnutrition and disease are projected to be in the hundreds of thousands. Over 120,000 Palestinians, at least, have been injured in Israeli attacks. Since October 7th, Israel has destroyed or damaged 70% of all structures in Gaza, including annihilating or damaging 92% of residential housing and nearly 90% of all schools, as well as all universities. It has demolished or rendered unusable civilian infrastructure vital for sustaining life in Gaza, including water infrastructure and agricultural lands, as my colleague, Ms. Ahmad, discussed earlier. This volume of civilian harm can only lead to the conclusion that the Israeli government has systematically and deliberately attacked civilian persons and objects in Gaza. Israel has also adopted policies that further demonstrate its complete disregard for the principle of distinction. It has, for example, embraced strategies that de-civilianize the entirety of Gaza's population and much of its territory. This includes broadly defining Gaza's civilians and civilian objects as targetable extensions of Hamas's so-called terrorist infrastructure. Since the start of its onslaught, Israel has also treated the entirety of North Gaza as a military objective, which is a blatant violation of the distinction principle on its face. Things are even worse now. Currently, 80% of the Gaza Strip is treated as a military no-go zone by Israel. The Israeli government has adopted AI targeting protocols like the Lavender program, which upend what it means to be a civilian under the principle of distinction. Lavender does this by targeting people not based on their direct participation in hostilities or their membership in an armed group, but rather based on their so-called shared characteristics with known members of Hamas or other Palestinian groups. Since the total destruction of an adversary almost certainly goes beyond the UN Charter's limits, Israel has most probably violated the principle of military necessity by making the annihilation of Hamas a core military goal. Its pursuit of genocide and ethnic cleansing also presumptively violates the principle of military necessity. Other policies demonstrate how Israel has gutted the principle of proportionality of its protective force. Instead of assessing proportionality based on the military advantage from each discrete attack, Israel has adopted a test that weighs the harm to civilians or civilian objects against the overall purpose of the war itself. This approach, which will almost always mean that attacks are deemed proportionate, basically turning the proportionality principle into a justification for the killing of civilians en masse. Israel has also defied the principles of good faith and reasonableness at the heart of the proportionality assessment by loosening its rules of engagement to permit the killing of up to 15 to 20 civilians in order to eliminate a junior Hamas officer and up to 100 civilians to assassinate a single commander. Finally, Israel has pursued policies that demonstrate its deliberate and consistent disregard for the principle of humanity. In numerous cases, Israel has failed to provide any warning to civilians before targeting civilian structures like homes. Since the start of the armed conflict, it has systematically attacked the so-called safe zones that it has created. Israel has even weaponized the principle of humanity to facilitate its attacks on civilians. So-called humanitarian corridors have been consistently subjected to bombardment, shelling, and sniper fire. Where civilians have refused to comply with Israel's evacuation orders, which they are permitted to do under international law, Israel has used that noncompliance as an excuse to directly target them. These are just a few examples, the proverbial tip of the iceberg, of how Israel has shredded IHL's protections for civilians and civilian objects through its onslaught against the Palestinian people. The names of those being projected on the screen are but a fraction of the lives lost as a direct result of Israel's crimes. The full video, which is 7 months old and therefore missing thousands of names, goes on for another hour and 45 minutes. We stand on the edge of the world where war makes genocide permissible and humanity is swallowed by the military and security interests of powerful states. To face down this nightmare, It is not just urgent and crucial to end these crimes now. It is vital to ensure that Israel is held fully accountable for what it has done to the people of Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Jamshidi. Next is Dr. Wesam Ahmad, who is the director of the Center for Applied International Law at Al-Haq organization and the coordinator of its business and human rights program. Al-Haq is a leading Palestinian human rights organization based in Ramallah. Dr. Ahmad's area of research focuses on the economic incentive structure which perpetuates the colonization of Palestine along business lines. He has a JD from Louisiana State University and graduate degrees in law and a doctorate from the Irish Center for Human Rights in Galway, Ireland. And he'll be talking about the attacks on healthcare. The floor is yours. Please help me welcome Wesam.
Thank you very much for that very added bio. It was an older one. The doctor does not apply. I have an LLM from the Irish Center for Human Rights, but my bio is really irrelevant here. Thank you very much, Maryam, for laying the groundwork for these principles of international humanitarian law that we see being completely dismantled. And I think the example of looking at the systematic destruction of Gaza's healthcare system is a very important example to highlight this. But before I start, I want to acknowledge the important work that was done by Al-Haq's Legal Research and Advocacy Team, our Monitoring and Documentation Department, and all the work that went into putting this submission together. I've merely been tasked with presenting the submission, so I hope I will do it justice. So, starting with the first slide we have here, through the demonstrated intent to destroy the healthcare system in the Gaza Strip, Israel is inflicting genocide against the Palestinian people as Israel, 1, targets and kills healthcare workers, 2, causes serious bodily injury and mental harm to the Palestinian people by deliberately preventing access to healthcare and life-saving humanitarian aid, and 3, deliberately inflicts conditions of life on the Palestinian people calculated to bring about their destruction in whole or in part by collapsing the entire healthcare system in the Gaza Strip. If we can go to the next slide. So evidence of Israeli officials' dolus specialis to commit genocide has been significant, persistent, and overt since October 2023 and before. Incitement to genocide on the part of Israeli officials, combined with the acts of killing, injuring, and disappearing healthcare workers and the other civilians, as well as systematically destroying all 36 hospitals in the Gaza Strip, some repeatedly, points to both direct and indirect evidence of genocidal intent. Indeed, healthcare workers, civilians, and hospitals have been signaled out for targeting. Is this, can you go back? Right here, yes. You have Giora Eland, a reservist major general, former head of the Israeli National Security Council and advisor to the Minister of Defense, wrote in an Israeli newspaper on the 19th of November 2023 that it is precisely Gaza's civil collapse that will bring an end to the war closer. When senior Israeli figures say in the media, it's either us or them, we should clarify the question, who is them? They are not only Hamas fighters with weapons, but also all the civilian officials, including hospital administrators and school administrators, and also the entire Gaza population, who enthusiastically supported Hamas on October 7th. And this is a quote. Another quote from Moshe Felen, an Israeli politician and leader of Zehut, a political party that advocates for West Bank annexation, stated in a TV interview on the 23rd of October, 2023, there is one and only one solution, which is to completely destroy Gaza before invading it. And when I talk about destruction, I mean destruction like it was done in Dresden, Hiroshima. But if you do them like it was done to Dresden, like what the British did, and if you burned everything, and if you threw the bombs to penetrate defensive structures, to penetrate Al-Shifa Hospital, and to destroy the ground from beneath it without any consequences. These statements have been complemented by Israeli officials making unsubstantiated statements about hospitals serving as command and control centers and hideouts, as well as unsubstantiated statements about Palestinian doctors involved in terrorist activities, who themselves have been detained, tortured, and even killed in Israeli prison camps. You can go to the next slide. The killing of healthcare workers specifically. Israel has deliberately targeted, detained, tortured, and killed healthcare workers in the Gaza Strip. Between October 2023 and May 2025, Israel killed more than 1,600 healthcare workers in Gaza. From the period of October 2023 to January 2024, Israeli occupying forces, IOF, killed healthcare workers in Gaza at a rate of 5 per day. As of April 2025, at least 412 humanitarian aid workers, including 291 UN staff, were killed by Israeli forces. The World Health Organization has recorded 720 attacks on healthcare infrastructure in Gaza between October 2023 and May 2025. One of the most notable attacks on healthcare includes the killing of 5-year-old Hind Rajab. In January 2024, paramedics Yusuf Zeno and Ahmad al-Madhoun were killed by the IOF when their ambulance was struck with a tank shell as they attempted to rescue Hind, despite coordinating their route with Israeli forces beforehand. Hind, injured and alone, died waiting for rescuers that never arrived. Most recently, on the 23rd of March 2025, Israel deliberately executed 15 paramedics and emergency rescue workers while they were responding to an emergency call in Rafah. After a week-long search, their bodies, along with the ambulances, were found buried in a mass grave. Israel detained at least 339 healthcare workers by February 2025. And of those 339, 96 who were released have testified that they were subjected to torture, ill treatment, deprivation of food and water, threats of rape and sexual violence, and degrading treatment while in Israeli detention. The UN Commission of Inquiry on the OPT has determined that the mistreatment of Palestinian detainees by Israeli authorities is the result of an intentional policy. One surgeon testified that prison guards were given instructions to deliberately damage his hands, stating they wanted to make sure that I could never return to work. Next slide. At least 4 healthcare workers have been killed in Israeli custody. Dr. Iyad Rantisi, head of obstetrics department at Kamal Adwan Hospital, was detained on the 11th of November 2023. He was killed 6 days later as a result of torture and ill treatment in Shikma prison, where he was interrogated by the Shin Bet, the Israeli security agency. Dr. Adnan al-Bursh, head of orthopedic department at Al-Shifa Hospital, was detained on the 18th of December 2023. Dr. al-Bursh was killed in Al-Far prison in April 2024 with signs of torture on his body. He was reportedly raped to death. Dr. Ziad al-Dalu, an internal medicine physician, was taken by Israeli forces from Al-Shifa Hospital on the 18th of March 2024. Just 3 days later, on 21 March, Dr. Dalu was killed in Israeli custody. Mr. Hamdan Hassan al-Naba, a senior paramedic at Nasser Hospital, was detained by the IOF on the 2nd of December 2023 while evacuating patients south along the Israeli designated safe route. His family was informed in September 2024 that he was killed in Israeli custody. Israel is still withholding their bodies. The next slide, please. Israel has deliberately inflicted serious bodily and mental harm on the Palestinian people through the destruction of the healthcare system in Gaza, including by directly attacking healthcare workers and hospitals themselves, by annihilating Gaza's healthcare system, thereby preventing the Palestinian people from accessing basic critical medical care while subjecting the population to constant bombardment and airstrikes that place them in dire need of medical intervention to prevent death or debilitating injury. Israel is causing serious bodily and mental harm to the Palestinians in Gaza. As of May 2025, Israel has killed over 53,000 Palestinians and injured more than 120,000 more. Disease, dehydration, and famine are spreading rapidly throughout the Gaza Strip, as Israel has imposed a total blockade on any food, water, fuel, or medicine entering Gaza since the 2nd of March 2025, the longest period of a total siege in the Gaza Strip. Forced starvation and the spread of disease has serious implications for the future development of Palestinian children, in particular, and their right to health. By March 2024, all 335,000 children under the age of 5 in Gaza were at high risk for severe malnutrition, which carries severe developmental consequences. Children are now dying from starvation in Gaza. At least 26 Palestinians were killed by starvation, mostly children and elderly, within 24 hours on 20 May 2025, with many more expected to die in the coming days. By July 2024, the polio virus made a resurgence in the Gaza Strip for the first time since it was eradicated 25 years ago. As a result, 602,000 children are vulnerable to permanent paralysis and chronic disabilities. Israeli officials have stated plainly there is only one solution, which is to completely destroy Gaza, and that all basic necessities, including food, water, fuel, and electricity, would be prevented from entering Gaza because, I quote, "we are fighting human animals, and we act accordingly." This is a member of the Knesset, Osher Shaklim, stated with regard to giving Palestinians access to humanitarian aid. "I wouldn't even give them a crumb of bread, neither to Gaza nor to Hamas. I wouldn't bring them a drop of water." Thus, any mental harm inflicted from the forced starvation, lack of access to basic resources, and destruction of healthcare services was deliberately imposed by Israel in its pursuit to destroy Palestinians in Gaza in whole or in part. Next slide. Israel has deliberately targeted, destroyed, or rendered inoperable all 36 hospitals in the Gaza Strip in violation of international humanitarian law principles, protecting hospitals and medical establishments during an armed conflict. The direct targeting and destruction of Al-Shifa Hospital, the largest hospital in the occupied Palestinian territory and the beating heart of the healthcare system in Gaza, is representative of the attack on the healthcare system as a whole in an attempt to deliberately inflict conditions of life calculated to bring about the physical destruction of the Palestinian people. Israel besieged and invaded Al-Shifa Hospital twice, first in November 2023 and again in March 2024, culminating in its complete destruction. During the 2-week invasion of the hospital in March, the IOF used the medical facility as a detention and interrogation site, with photos showing Palestinians detained in the hospital courtyard, blindfolded, hands zip-tied, wearing white jumpsuits. Healthcare workers, patients, and civilians were deprived of food, water, medicines, and the basic necessities. In at least one instance, healthcare workers and patients had to share one bottle of water between 15 people. At least 21 patients died during the invasion because healthcare workers were prevented from carrying out their duties. More than 400 people in and around the hospital were killed, including 5 doctors and several hundred Palestinians that were detained. Among those killed, Dr. Ahmad al-Makadme and his mother, Dr. Yusra al-Makadme, whose bodies were found executed near the hospital. Those who survived the invasion of the hospital were evacuated to Al-Ahli Hospital on the 1st of April 2024, where some required limb amputations, and whose wounds were infected with maggots as a direct result of the IOF preventing proper medical care to patients during the siege. 3 mass graves filled with at least 79 bodies were discovered in the courtyard of Al-Shifa Hospital upon Israeli withdrawal. Several corpses were zip-tied, indicating that they were executed while restrained, while other corpses were severely disfigured. Makeshift burial sites in the hospital courtyard were desecrated by Israeli forces, with human remains visible and exposed above the soil. Similarly, when the IOF withdrew from their siege of the Nasser Hospital on the 7th of April 2024, they left behind several mass graves filled with 392 bodies. Among the killed were the elderly, women, and wounded patients. Some bodies recovered were found stripped of their clothing and with gunshots to the head or neck. Next slide, please. Actually, can you go back to the previous one? I think it's important to take note of this message that was left by Dr. Mahmoud Abu Najla on the 20th of October 2023. Whoever stays until the end will tell the story. We did what we could. Remember us. And this is the same message after it was bombed on the 21st of November 2023. And I think at the very least, we are taking this message and we are doing what we can to tell the story. This is the bare minimum that we can do. Next slide. So Israel's direct targeting of Al-Shifa Hospital was part of a broader strategy to systematically destroy the healthcare system in its entirety. I'll go to the last slide, please. So in conclusion, the attacks on Gaza's healthcare system as a pattern of genocide that is ongoing and intensifying. On the 20th of March, 2025, Israel blew up the Turkish Palestinian Friendship Hospital. On 23 March 2025, Israel executed 15 emergency first responders before burying them in their ambulances in a mass grave. On the 13th of May 2025, Israel directly struck both the Nasser and European hospitals, killing civilians and rendering the European hospital out of service, cutting off access to neurosurgery, cardiac care, and cancer treatment that are unavailable elsewhere in Gaza. Repeated attacks on Gaza's hospitals and healthcare workers are part of a deliberate and systematic pattern to render Gaza unlivable and to destroy Palestinian life. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wesam. Next is Professor Heidi Matthews. Professor Matthews is an assistant professor of law at York University's Osgood Hall Law School in Toronto, where she researches and teaches in areas of international criminal law, international legal history, gender studies, and political theory. She received her first law degree from McGill University and SJD, Doctorate in Juridical Science, from Harvard University. During her legal career, Professor Matthews has served as a law clerk to the judges of the Appeal Chamber at the Special Court of Sierra Leone and as an intern at the immediate office of the prosecutor at the Special Tribunal for Lebanon. She's active in several international research networks, including critical approaches to international criminal law and Cold War international law projects. Please help me welcome Professor Matthews.
Okay, so can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, all right, great. So I would say thanks for having me, but I think we'd all prefer not to be in this position. Put it down. Yeah, I'm a shorty. Okay. So actually, I'm glad that I was bumped from the second panel to the third one because it the previous two talks really set the stage nicely for the basic principles of international humanitarian law, which oftentimes, when they're infringed, can amount to international crimes, including the crime of genocide, as Article 2 of the Genocide Convention, sub A, B, and C. There's also a sub D and E to the convention. I'm going to talk about sub D, so specifically the imposition of measures intended to prevent births within a protected group. So for our purposes here, the Palestinian group living in Gaza. We won't talk about sub E because it's not implicated in the facts before us, but just to put it on the table, is the deliberate transfer of children from a protected group to another group. And I mention that because as a Canadian citizen of settler heritage, that element was core to Canada's historical and ongoing genocide against various Indigenous peoples as well. So just to be clear about that. Oh, right, I don't have the clicker, you have the clicker, okay. Okay, so the thing that sets preventing births apart from the other underlying acts of genocide that have already been so expertly described for you is this idea of biological destruction. So killing members of a group, which is sub A, causing serious bodily or mental harm, which is sub B, and imposing conditions calculated to bring about the physical destruction of a group in whole or in part. This is law professors get to memorize legislation, is sub C. Those all refer to what's known as physical destruction. In other words, the annihilation of a protected group physically, right? And generally what that intended to prevent births. And it's never actually been charged as a standalone act of genocide in an international criminal tribunal. So it was certainly contemplated during the drafting of the Genocide Convention in light of various acts undertaken by the Nazi government of Germany, including things like sterilization or compulsory abortion, segregation of the sexes, and other obstacles to marriage. These are the kind of historical understandings of what biological destruction encompasses. But we don't actually have any real jurisprudence at all, interestingly, on this area. So South Africa, in its case against Israel at the ICJ, has charged biological destruction, in other words, preventing births, as a standalone act of genocide. But confusingly, if you go through the materials in depth, what it's also done is put forward various acts supporting that claim in support of the idea that measures intended to prevent births also constitute sub C of Article 2 of the Convention, namely conditions calculated to bring about the physical destruction of the group in whole or in part. Okay, so it's a little bit technical, but it's actually really important because it creates a confusion internally to South Africa's case that needs to be cleared up, because this is likely, well, I'll say more about that. Probably going to be the first instance where we're going to get some actual case law on this question, right, which we don't really have until now. And so the court should think carefully about it. And of course, anybody who's studying the process of the genocide in Gaza needs to understand that. So, right. So, of course, just the very basic nature of the law here is that rather than talking about annihilation of the group, biological destruction is aimed at the group's capacity to regenerate itself. We might also understand that in terms of its reproductive power or capacity. Oftentimes we'll see, particularly in the international human rights literature, coming out of bodies associated with like the Women, Peace and Security agenda or the Women and Children agenda, we tend to think about biological destruction less in terms of actual biological destruction and more in terms of a sexual or gender-based crime, right? So a crime that is directed primarily towards women and girls or people who reproduce, right? On the basis that, obviously women and girls and other people who reproduce take on, in that capacity, take on a differential burden in terms of societal roles, family roles, and obviously in terms of healthcare as well. But what I'm going to suggest to you is that actually that's a mistake, and what we need to do is understand biological destruction as a crime that can be inflicted, and in fact, in the circumstances prevailing in Gaza at the moment, is inflicted both with respect, to all genders, including women and girls and men and boys, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. So, yeah, next slide, please. Okay, so the very few hints that we do have that are from the jurisprudence that have sort of been stated in obiter, so they're not really binding, but they've come out here and there in the courts that have dealt with this. The Akayesu decision, famed decision from the ICTR in the 90s, primarily because it understood rape and sexual violence as a predicate act of genocide, okay? So I would suggest is a fairly problematic, normatively, understanding of what preventing births or biological genocide should look like. So Akayesu says in the judgment, the judges say the measures in question should be construed as sexual mutilation, the practice of sterilization, yada yada, forced birth control, separation of sexes, and prohibition of marriages, as well as mental harm. Okay, all good so far, I think. But when we get to the second part, they start talking about kind of assumptions about how certain cultures and religions may or may not function, right? And so the judges say rape can be a measure intended to prevent births when the person raped refuses subsequently to procreate in the same way that members of a group can be led through threats or trauma not to procreate. And so there's a long critique within a certain strain of feminist thinking with respect to international criminal law that I find myself a part of, which is to say that this kind of language risks actually victim blaming the society who is being victimized through this sort of violence, right? So is it for the judges to actually talk about the stigma, which may or may not result with respect to victims? So, but this is what we have currently from the courts. I think it's arguably quite problematic. Next slide, thanks. Okay, so in terms of the mens rea component, so that's the intent component. Of course, you need to have the special intent of destruction of the group in whole or in part for the crime of genocide, but you also need to show intent with respect to the actual prevention of births, right? And so this is very much an open question. We have, again, it was alluded to in an earlier talk that the jurisprudence of the ICJ, with respect to the war in Bosnia and Croatia and the former Yugoslavia in general is quite problematic. That is absolutely true with respect to this Article 2 sub D. And so what the court does in the Croatia decision in 2015 is actually to say, well, there was sexual and gender-based violence, but it wasn't on such a systemic scale that we can infer an intent to actually prevent births within the group. And so there's no evidence for genocide for this particular sub-act. Now, I believe it was Nimmer who really helpfully mentioned the intervention, which I don't think those states knew they were getting into at the time with what they said. So the joint intervention is super important, I think, in terms of opinio juris and also giving us, some pretty heady language with which to push forward the jurisprudence in a more progressive and sustainable way. And so in the Myanmar case, this is a selection from that joint intervention. They do some problematic stuff too, but also some helpful stuff. One of the helpful things is to say that where sexual and gender-based violence takes place on a significant scale, it can serve to demonstrate actually both physical and biological intent. Special intent can be inferred from the long-term implications of underlying acts of genocide, including its regenerative power. So this is quite an expansive interpretation, based on the previous ICJ case law. And specifically, and this is true not just for measures intended to prevent births, but really the entire law of genocide, with respect to how evidence relating to the targeting and impacts on children should be evaluated by the courts. Specifically, these joint interveners say that courts need to look very closely at the impacts on acts where children are the victims, because children themselves make up a substantial part of the group, and as you'll see in the quote, are essential to the survival of the group as such, since the physical destruction of the group is assured where it is unable to regenerate itself. So you might already be able to see a little bit of conceptual slippage and confusion actually inside of the joint intervener submission here, because they're kind of talking about physical destruction and biological destruction at the same time, but potentially some really helpful material here as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'll try and do this quickly and probably getting up to time. This is not an exhaustive iteration of the available evidence. It's kind of my own attempt to categorize it, partly using South Africa submissions, partly using my own sort of powers of interpolation. And so, so it's not exhaustive, so take it for what it's worth, but I think helpful to get it on the table. So one, which has already been talked about a little bit, is the disproportionate killing of women and children. So over the course of the conflict, something like 21.3 women are killed each day in Gaza. Again, assuming, right, that women bear a certain sort of reproductive burden within the protected group here, but they're not the only ones that do, and we'll get to that. There are several documented cases of the intentional targeting via sniper activity and other modes of attack involving pregnant women, and it should be said both in Gaza, increasingly in the West Bank as well. And the Euromed Human Rights Monitor recently put out a report saying that in its estimation, Israel is pursuing a policy of killing Palestinian women as a tool to destroy an entire demographic, so basically a tool of genocide. Next slide, please. Okay, conditions of life. So this is where things get a little confusing, because a lot of this evidence, again, can also be marshaled in support of an Article 2C conditions of life claim. I'm not going to talk about any of that. I'm just looking at sub D, but a lot of this information can be put under that category as well. So here I'm looking specifically at conditions of life related to destroying the capacity to procreate within the group. For obvious reasons, the systematic use of starvation will have impacts on fertility rates, will cause and has caused sharp increases in prenatal and postnatal complications, infectious diseases, miscarriages, stillbirths, all kinds of negative outcomes when it comes to reproduction. There's reportedly a 300% rise in miscarriages, I imagine for a number of different reasons, including traumatic stress. And reportedly, since the beginning of the total blockade, over 300 reported miscarriages alone, and a general sort of deprioritization of reproductive health care, of course, as a result, as we've just heard about, of the sort of total decimation of the healthcare system in Gaza. Next slide, please. Forced displacement, I think, is a really important one, because it's not included in the Genocide Convention as an underlying mode of genocide, but given the way, especially as we've seen it roll out on the ground in Gaza, actually kind of includes all of the underlying acts of genocide, or arguably. And so under certain conditions, forced displacement can have biologically destructive consequences, right? So particularly under the conditions that currently in here in Gaza, which we've already heard quite a bit about, we don't need to reiterate, just in terms of numbers, again, most of the population has been displaced multiple times, and so that's a population that contains some 60,000 currently pregnant women and girls as well. Next slide, please. Direct attacks on reproductive health care. We've heard a lot about healthcare in general, so just to note that in particular, there have been direct attacks on fertility clinics. We will have, I'm sure all know about the Al Basma IVF Center, right, which previously had conducted in the range of 100 IVF procedures and had all of, well, not only was the facility destroyed, but all of the reproductive material, including embryos and other material, was destroyed as well. yeah, the general lack of access to reproductive health care is impacting, well over 500,000 women and girls. Next slide. Okay, so this is the thing I want to just emphasize a little bit, and it builds on Lisa's excellent talk earlier. So about the what we might call sexual and gender-based violence, but the reproductive impacts of that violence, including within detention and including with respect to men and boys. And so there's, ample evidence of men and boys being targeted in the genitals, sort of in the field, right, as it were, so being shot directly in the genitals and then reporting to hospitals with those sorts of wounds. But also direct attacks on genitalia for using a number of different horrendous sorts of practices, which constitute torture. In detention as well. Interestingly, the International Independent Commission found that those acts constitute sexual and gender-based violence against men, as well as the international crime of persecution, but they don't get into any of the reproductive aspects of that, which I think is a mistake, which also betrays a certain bias against understanding attacks against men and boys in terms of their reproductive capacity, and here in terms specifically of biological genocide. And so my suggestion to all of us who are thinking about genocide law and how it should be really written with respect to this specific underlying act of genocide would be very much to take a much more critical lens with respect to the way in which we generally privilege harm occasioned to women and girls, and sort of leave out other sorts of harm that undoubtedly will have implications with respect to the capacity of the group to regenerate itself. And I think there might be one more slide, but okay, yeah. So I would also argue that the massive levels of detention that Lisa described might also constitute separation or segregation of the sexes for the purposes of preventing reproduction. We've already touched briefly on starvation, and is that the last one? I think so. Yeah, okay, great. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Matthews. Next is Dr. Thayer Ahmad. Dr. Ahmad is an MD. MD is a board-certified emergency medicine physician working in Chicago. He's also an attending physician and is the assistant program director for the residency program and the global health director of the emergency department. Dr. Ahmad is a board member of the Palestinian American Medical Association and is an assistant clinical professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and adjunct professor at Wake Forest University School of Medicine. Please help me welcome Dr. Thayer.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity of being here. I know it's been a lot of information today, and I see that our audience has thinned out considerably, so I appreciate everybody that's here, and I want to at least acknowledge that it has been really a heavy day hearing everything that has taken place over the last 19, almost 20 months now, and I understand that that does have quite a bit of toll on everyone. I want to begin my testimony by saying that I've been to Gaza and the West Bank as a humanitarian and as a healthcare worker several times over the last 15 years. And I've seen the development and the progress of healthcare institutions and systems within Palestine, and have witnessed the aftermath of many of the aggressions on Gaza and the West Bank. I will say something that many of you already know, and it's clear given our presence and attendance here today, but the degree of destruction and devastation and violence we've seen over the last 20 months in Gaza is among the worst that we've ever seen, is the worst that we've seen. I entered Gaza in early 2024 as a volunteer emergency medical team member that's coordinated under the World Health Organization. And I want to start first by saying how it was entering Gaza. So as you drive through the Sinai desert, what you are struck with as you approach Gaza, kilometers away, are the many trucks that are sitting idly at the side of the road. Trucks that you know contain items like food, filters, tents, blankets, winter clothes, all of the necessities that are so desperately needed on the other side if you speak to anybody that's on the ground. Once we made it to Rafah, this is a normally bustling border with people walking through. You are struck by the fact that there is nobody, that you are the only people that are there. There's nobody passing through it. It's only the Egyptian border patrol that you see. And as we cross to the Palestinian side of Rafah, again, one of the first things you notice is that there's no electricity. It's an electricity blackout. And that's been the case since October 11th, 2023, after then Ministry of Energy, Israel Katz, decided to cut off the electricity supply. That's supplied through the Israeli Electric Corporation. But that's paid for by the Palestinian Authority. It's not given as any sort of charity, as might be implied when it's reported that the Israelis turned off the electricity. As we drove to our guest house in Rafah, Rafah is I would call it a rural government of Gaza. What you see is that it is overwhelmed and inundated with Palestinians from all over Gaza. In fact, we had arrived in the evening, so we could only see people through the headlights of the truck that we were being transported in. And you could see that there is tents everywhere and people everywhere, as indication of how much the degree of displacement that had taken place early in 2024. The next day, I would be transported to Nasser Hospital. Nasser Hospital is the second largest hospital in Gaza prior to October 7th. And at the time, it was the largest hospital that was functioning because of what we heard about what took place at Shifa in November 2023, and then subsequently again in March 2024. So the burden on southern and central hospitals in Gaza at the time of our arrival, the burden was very high. Specifically, Shuhada al-Aqsa in Deir al-Balah, central Gaza, Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis, and then further south, European Gaza Hospital, which is on the border between Khan Yunis and Rafah. My time at Nasser was riddled with mass casualty incidents or mass casualty events. What this means is that there are multiple patients who are arriving at your facility at the same time who are victims of trauma. And this was happening multiple times a day. And the reason I want to point this out is because there's no hospital in the United States, there's no hospital in Chicago that would have been able to function had they seen the same volume that was being seen at Nasser Hospital. They would do something, they would go on bypass, which is essentially they would not receive any new patients and they would divert these patients to other healthcare institutions. Of course, this was impossible in Gaza, and the number of patients continued to arrive. We often lacked the supplies that we needed, the medications that we would need, and the space to address the needs of the patients that we were receiving. And there would be no indication from anybody, from the World Health Organization, from the Ministry of Health, from any of the international NGOs, of when we would be able to restock the supplies or the medications that we needed. And oftentimes, the medications that were requested of international NGOs, of the Ministry of Health, of the World Health Organization, they would procure these items outside of the Gaza Strip, and then they would fall in line with the other trucks that we watched that were sitting outside in Egypt because of inspections, bureaucratic delays, and what the Israelis would call the presence of dual list items, items that they felt could also be used through violent means. We would often have to assess, treat, and even declare patients dead who were brought to us on the floor of the hospital because there was literally no more hospital beds available. The hospital was also overwhelmed with internally displaced Palestinians. There were over 10,000 in early 2024 that were sheltering in and around Nasser Hospital. And we know those numbers that Shifa, prior to it being under siege, surrounded, invaded, and destroyed, had reached 20, 30, even some say 40,000. And hunger and malnutrition was already noticeable in early 2024. And all of the patients and people that we interacted with, the patients, the families, the displaced families, they were dealing with food security issues and were dependent on the soup kitchens or the food aid packages or internationally sponsored bakeries. They were totally dependent on these meals. And we saw negative coping mechanisms where adults would skip most of the meals, and sometimes go 24 hours without eating. And children are not being exposed to all of the food groups. They were exposed to maybe 1 or 2 food groups that they would need for an appropriate nutritional balanced diet. The majority of our trauma patients were women and children, and Khan Yunis in early 2024 was being leveled in geographic fashion. It appeared that the city, block by block, was being destroyed from east to west. And we would watch from the windows of the hospital as giant balls of smoke would fill the sky. And then 10 or 15 minutes later, we'd get an influx of the mass casualty event that I mentioned earlier. Many of these patients would demonstrate injuries from having buildings collapsed on them. Some would be burned from the ensuing fires that would happen after a bombing. But we also had a significant number of gunshot wounds and shrapnel injuries. And these are described as penetrating trauma. And that's because of the way that they pierce through the body, and they require more aggressive investigations by medical providers to see what is the source of the problem that you need to address, that you need to treat. So I'd like to highlight a couple of cases that I personally treated and another couple of cases that I'm familiar with, just to better demonstrate the widespread devastation, because we've heard quite clearly what the statistics are, and my colleagues on the panel have laid out really kind of the degree that you've seen and what it looked like. The first patient I took care of was a young man in his late 20s, and because of the targeting of first responders and ambulances, and Sam showed a picture, I think, of the destroyed ambulance of Yusuf and Ahmad, who were supposed to rescue Hind and were killed in the process. But anybody that's been on the ground in Gaza saw similar pictures to destroyed ambulances all over the Gaza Strip. In the courtyard of the hospital, on the side of the street, ambulances literally destroyed and bombed out. And first responders had started to communicate with us that it was increasingly dangerous to respond to areas where they knew there were patients there because of what they called a double tap or a triple tap, where there is a strike on a residential home or in an area, they rush to the area, and then there's a second strike that's in place. And I personally treated 2 first responders who were injured in a double tap strike. This patient was somebody who took his donkey cart and would go and retrieve injured people and bring them back to the hospital. In fact, the local staff, as a joke, called him Rocket, because the donkey cart is so slow moving back and forth, but he would continue to go and rescue patients. And one of the times that he brought the patients back, his donkey cart and himself were injured in the attack. And he was brought to the hospital and he was recovering in the ICU. And after about a week, after suffering severe injuries, like his lung had collapsed, he had multiple fractures, he had to have something called an exploratory laparotomy because there was concern that he had internal bleeding, he died. And in his, one of the things that struck me was also our inability to communicate with his family that he had died. Even though they were among the displaced at Nasser Hospital, at the time in 2024, there was a total telecommunications blackout that was imposed by the Israelis. And so his family came to the ICU the following morning and had seen that the bed that their son was recovering in was empty. And that was how they found out that their son had been killed in this airstrike. He did not survive it. Another patient was an elderly woman. She's around 70 years old. She was coming from Rafah to Khan Yunis, and she was also on the back of a donkey cart. She had heard that there would be a food distribution in Khan Yunis. And in the process, what she referred to as a quadcopter, which is what we came to realize was a drone that was armed with something, maybe an AR-15 or some other weapon, she was shot twice, once in the chest and once in the back. Her lung had collapsed and we had to place a chest tube to reinflate her lung. But the bullet was lodged in her spine, and this 70-year-old woman was now paralyzed from the waist down. We didn't have any rehabilitative services. There was no plan for her to go to surgery, and so she was sent to another area of the hospital. But ultimately, her family had to take care of her and take her to the tent that they were displaced to, and she would need 24-hour care by her family, but never getting the care that she needed because of the lack of services that were available. We saw many children who were killed and wounded. The smaller children are often unable to withstand the blunt force trauma that occurs when a bomb falls on the building. They're much less likely to survive than an adult would. But I want to specifically mention an evening where I was rounding in the pediatric building of Nasser Hospital. Every room that could not have been larger than 20 square meters or 30 square meters had 4 pediatric patients in each room, and all of the rooms were filled. And they usually would have one companion with a mother. So these are very overcrowded conditions. There's one particular room that only had 3 patients, and the corner had been damaged. The nurse that was rounding with me at the time told me that this was the room of Dunya Abu Muhsin. The reason I mentioned Dunya Abu Muhsin is because she's a 12-year-old who had lived in Khan Yunis with her family, and her home had been bombed. Her entire family had been killed, her mother, her father, and her 3 siblings. And she had been interviewed by many international outlets as she was recovering in Nasser Hospital. She lost her leg as a result of the bombing on her home, and she was recovering at Nasser. The nursing staff told me that as the days began to pass, they also started to know that Dunya was growing increasingly withdrawn and depressed. She started to feel the loss of her family, and this was something that they were not familiar with how to address. I mean, there's something called psychological first aid, but then there's also the mental health needs of so many of the people that had been victims of the trauma. But on December 17th, 2023, less than a month before I had arrived, an Israeli tank fired a shell at Nasser Hospital, broke through the room, and hit Dunya, killing her. So Dunya, 2 weeks after losing her entire family and was recovering, had been killed because there was a direct attack on the hospital by an Israeli tank. And as I moved on from Dunya's room, I checked on over 25 children who were shot or wounded by Israeli forces. Many of them had injuries that were going to be permanently disabling and preventing them from gaining the degree of independence that would be needed for these children to actually have a chance. More than a dozen had external fixators, which is a medical device used to hold broken bones in the right position while they heal. It's like a metal frame that sits outside, and there are these pins and screws that go through the skin into the bone. And the idea is align the bones closely and hopefully they'll heal. But for many of these kids, really healing the limb was going to be impossible, and getting function was not going to be something that was going to be reasonable. And so many of them would stay in these external fixators for months with no real plan moving forward, again, because of the lack of the services that were needed. I want to also make a point about patients who require healthcare services, and we alluded to it, the indirect deaths. And I want to mention specifically cases that I had been involved with. And this is something that I don't think has been given as much attention because there should be no mistake made. This excess mortality that we're seeing in Gaza is being caused by the war on Gaza. It's being caused by the Israeli military. They are, in other words, casualties of war. 2 specific examples from my time. There is a 15-year-old boy. His name is Muhammad al-Laham. And he had a congenital kidney disease where he needed dialysis. And dialysis is something that you cannot go a decent amount of time without. Most patients need 3 dialysis sessions a week. Well, with so many people being displaced in Gaza, the dialysis center in Khan Yunis and any dialysis machines in Rafah were overwhelmed, inundated with patients. And so the medical providers in Gaza felt that they would have to give each patient some degree of dialysis, but not enough. They would try to get by with what they could. Well, Muhammad al-Laham was not getting enough dialysis and came into our department suffering a cardiac arrest and dying because he was not getting the treatment that he needed. And as is the case in many regions, winter in Gaza brought about the spread of different respiratory illnesses. But given the lack of access of clean water, in fact, sometimes at Nasser Hospital, we would run out of water. We'd turn on the sink and there's no water coming out of it. We saw respiratory viruses like COVID, influenza, RSV. It spread rapidly. And for children with asthma who were suffering from a viral illness, this would cause their asthma to flare up. But we did not have the breathing treatments that you would typically be giving to these patients for them to be able to handle this. So they're getting complications from these illnesses. And we even saw at Abu Yusuf al-Najjar Hospital in Rafah, an infant who otherwise should have survived this illness die as a result of probably COVID or RSV or flu. This leads to long-term consequences to their health and development. I want to mention finally just the targeting of healthcare workers in hospitals. While at Nasser and Aqsa, while at Nasser Hospital, Aqsa had become surrounded by Israeli forces. And so we saw physicians arriving to Nasser Hospital who had left. And the hospital at Aqsa had suffered damage. So the ICU, in fact, had a window where the physicians would go and rest during their 24-hour shifts that had a bullet come right through the window where a physician was sleeping at the time. And so on January 16th, the Israeli military announced that a rocket had been fired from Nasser Medical Complex while we were there. And of course, myself, the international staff, and the local staff, nobody had seen any rocket being fired or had heard a rocket that had been fired. And we knew that the Israeli military was getting closer and closer to the hospital at Nasser just from seeing how their campaign had been conducted. The WHO emergency medical team lead, he sent a message to one of the international doctors that I was working with, and he put a link to the Israeli military came, which they posted on X, that said that there was a rocket fired, and he just put a text that said FYI. The next evening, Israeli tanks began to surround the perimeter of the hospital. We would see them from the window of the hospital, and panic ensued. All of the displaced people that were in the courtyard began packing their things at 2, 3 a.m. in the morning and heading further south to Rafah, and many of the staff were leaving the hospital to go and take their family to Rafah. Over the next 2 days, the hospital looked empty compared to how it was packed the previous days. And we were moved from Nasser Hospital to Aqsa Hospital to work there. In the subsequent weeks, the hospital was raided by the Israeli military after it had come under siege. And doctors that I worked with, Dr. Khalid Assir, Dr. Nahid, Dr. Mahmoud, all physicians who I had worked with in the previous weeks had been abducted by the Israeli military. And from the colleagues that had been abducted, Dr. Nahid specifically was the leader of the surgical department at Nasser Hospital. They mentioned that he was, when he was handcuffed and he was tied up, he was consistently telling the Israeli soldiers about how it was too tight and that his hands felt like there was no blood flow. This is a surgeon telling these soldiers this, and so kind of consistent with what we heard earlier. And the soldier responded by going to Dr. Nahid and pushing on his fingers and saying, no, it's fine, you're getting enough blood flow. Of course, this is something that, any medical professional would find ridiculous. Dr. Khalid Assir spent 6 months detained by the Israelis and being released, never charged, had lost over 80 pounds in the process, and detailed how the different abuses that he was subjected to. Dr. Nahid and Dr. Mahmoud, who was in the ICU with me, we still have not heard from. They have not been charged with anything. I would be remiss without also mentioning Dr. Hussam Abu Safiya, who I've communicated with and who I'm still in contact with his family. And the reason his case is particularly noteworthy is he had already previously been detained and questioned by the Israelis in one of their many raids on Kamal Adwan Hospital in the north of Gaza. Every time, of course, they found nothing on Dr. Hussam, but he became a more vocal advocate for his patients in Gaza. He wrote 2 op-eds in the New York Times, one on October 29th, 2023, and then again on December 4th, 2024. He did many interviews with international media detailing the struggles that he was enduring, him and his staff, in their ability to be able to treat their patients. And then in October 2024, the Israeli military surrounded Kamal Adwan yet again. And his son, in October, was killed in an airstrike on hospital grounds and buried on hospital grounds. He himself was struck with shrapnel and injured in November of 2024. And then at the end of December, he was forced by the Israelis to empty the hospital of its patients and send them to other facilities, even though this was not, this was quite dangerous with respect to the critically ill patients that were at the hospital. Then the Israelis in the following week, and of course, Dr. Hussam has the famous video of him having to walk up to the tank. But the Physicians for Human Rights Israel had requests to the Israeli military, and they said there's no indication of the arrest or detention of the individual in question. And then they filed a petition with the Israeli High Court, and his location had been disclosed, and the Israelis finally confirmed that they were holding Dr. Hussam. It's been over several months now since Dr. Hussam has been detained, no charges, and his family's not been able to communicate with him. He's one of 150 healthcare workers still being held. So the attacks on healthcare workers and infrastructure are important to understand in the context of everything that we've talked about today, in the context of the limitations and restrictions around access that are being imposed by the Israelis. We're seeing even healthcare workers with Palestinian backgrounds, international healthcare workers, being rejected and denied. And in fact, other people arbitrarily being denied, like a 70-year-old retired American pediatrician or a Chinese-American military veteran. We see surgical specialists who coordinate months in advance, ready to perform surgeries, get denied last second by the Israelis. And this is all a part of this process of understanding how many people will suffer as a result of that. I myself was rejected on March 13th while I was in Amman from entering Gaza, and I'm one of scores of healthcare workers who have been denied entry. Process is arbitrary and random, but there's a clear effort to discriminate against Palestinian backgrounds, but also to make it as difficult as possible for healthcare workers to mount an emergency response. With that, I thank you all. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fahad. Next is Dr. Mimi Syed, who is an American emergency medicine physician and assistant clinical professor at the University of Washington and Washington State University. She's a fellow of the American College of Emergency Physicians. During the current Israeli onslaught on Gaza, she has volunteered to work during several months-long stints at both Al-Aqsa Hospital and Nasser Hospital. Since then, she has given numerous interviews to American and international media outlets and spoken widely at public and academic forums about her observations regarding the destruction of the Palestinian healthcare system in Gaza by Israel's military offensive. Please help me welcome Dr. Mimi Syed.
Hello, I'm Dr. Mimi Syed. And as my colleague here, we could finish each other's sentences. What we witnessed was so similar. And we didn't know each other before I went to Gaza, and we went to different hospitals. We went at different times of the year. So I will just read my testimony, and you can see for yourself. I'm Dr. Mimi Syed. I'm a board-certified emergency medicine physician, and I've been to Gaza twice. I went last year in August for a month at Al-Nasser Hospital, and then I went again in December to Al-Aqsa Hospital again for 4 weeks. I stand before you today not just as a physician, but as a mother and a human being who bears the truths that have been etched into my soul during my time in Gaza. I have seen the unthinkable, the inhumane, and the utterly heart-wrenching. The children of Gaza, with their eyes wide open and full of innocence, have been subjected to horrors that no child should ever face. I have seen them murdered, starved, and denied the most basic of human rights. Their cries for help echo in my mind, a haunting symphony of suffering that I cannot escape. The patients I treated in Gaza were the majority of children under the age of 12. On my first trip to Gaza in August, I have at least 18 documented cases of children who arrived in my emergency department with bullets to the head or the chest, and by witnesses reported to be shot by snipers or quadcopters. I have seen more brain matter out of skulls of small children due to shrapnel injuries than I ever thought possible in my entire lifetime. I will never forget the image of parents bringing their dead children wrapped in blankets and laying them on the floor so we could check for a pulse before pronouncing them all dead. This was a daily routine in Gaza, multiple times a day. The long line to the morgue where family members would wait for their loved ones so they could bury them with some shred of dignity will always be an unforgotten memory for me. Even when we did save some children from the jaws of death, their survival is at the mercy of the Israeli military's next airstrike or food deprivation. On my second trip in December, during a mass casualty incident, I recall an 8-year-old little girl named Allah. She arrived in an ambulance to Nasser Hospital with her father next to her. She was hit by a piece of shrapnel that opened her skull to expose half of her brain. Even though she was still moving slightly, given her devastating injury, the plan was to let her die because the rate of survival was very low for her. However, when I looked into the eyes of her father, I could not allow her to die without at least trying to stabilize her for further treatment. I imagined my own 8-year-old daughter laying there. I immediately secured her airway with a laryngoscope I had to smuggle in because I wasn't allowed to bring it in by the Israeli military. By some miracle, I was able to get her to surgery, and 3 weeks later, she was talking, reading, and walking and even saying, "Shukran, doctora, ana mkhair," 3 weeks later. Although I was able to help this little girl, she continues to have the threat of death looming over her at all times. She needs medical evacuation because there's only a skin flap covering her brain. She's at risk for infection, malnourishment, and death that was created by the Israeli government. I have photographs that speak louder than words, images of children playing in sewage, their laughter echoing in the streets flooded with waste. The lack of functioning sewage system and clean drinking water has created a public health crisis of monumental proportions. Babies, mere infants, were coming into our hospital with sepsis and organ failure, and their tiny bodies ravaged with high levels of E. coli. Chronic diarrhea is a constant for all children in Gaza, a completely preventable and unnecessary condition. The Israeli government's restriction of supplies for water purification is a death sentence for all of the children there. We are not just talking about infrastructure, we are talking about the very essence of human dignity and the right to life. It is important to note that all of these deplorable conditions are being manufactured deliberately by the Israeli government. In December, I treated a 29-year-old woman arrived at our hospital at Al-Aqsa with 3 small children next to her on the cot. She was bleeding profusely from an overgrown breast tumor, a condition that was curable with timely chemotherapy and surgery. It started off at the size of an olive in her breast. Prior to October 7th, she could have received this life-saving treatment in Gaza. But now this was impossible. She was denied evacuation even though she was approved by WHO. She was denied 4 times by the Israeli government for medical evacuation. By the time she reached me, there was nothing I could do to stabilize her. She came in bleeding from her breast tumor, so highly vascularized. I could only give her 2 units of blood, a temporary reprieve before she inevitably bled out in front of her 3 children on the cot. My colleagues later notified me that she had passed. This tragedy is not an isolated incident. The healthcare system in Gaza has been systematically dismantled with shortages of medical supplies, equipment, and personnel. The lack of basic medical supplies has made our job as healthcare providers nearly impossible. We were forced to work without gloves, hand soap, running water, or even electricity many times. I met healthcare workers who had been imprisoned and tortured. Their crime, simply working in the hospital on October 7th. They were beaten, humiliated, and subjected to unspeakable acts of cruelty. Healthcare workers who are supposed to be protected under international law have also been repeatedly targeted. Dr. Abu Safiya from Kamal Adwan Hospital is a stark example. He remains imprisoned and abused without charge, his only crime being his dedication to saving lives. Even paramedics are not spared. There would be airstrikes towards ambulances who were getting shot at while trying to bring wounded patients to the hospital. Every ambulance I saw had bullet holes or damage done to it by the Israeli military. In the past 18 months, we have also seen a disturbing pattern of targeting journalists, who are the eyes and ears of the world in these troubling times. Among them was my friend, Ayman al-Ghedi. The day he was brutally killed by an Israeli airstrike, Ayman visited me at Al-Aqsa Hospital. He was anxiously awaiting the birth of his first child with his wife. His excitement was palpable, and his hope for the future was a beacon of light in the darkness of Gaza. His car that was marked Press was struck by an Israeli missile that night. He was killed along with 4 other journalists right in front of the hospital where his son was born the next day. During my time in Gaza in December, I witnessed the targeting of civil defense workers. One night, a dozen civil defense workers who were trying to repair the sewage system arrived at our hospital. Half of them were already dead, and others were severely injured. Another night, when long-awaited humanitarian aid finally entered through the checkpoint, the civil defense workers guarding it from the looters was struck by bombs from the Israeli military. These were family men with young children. They all arrived dead except for one man in his early 20s. I was able to save him for one night so his family could say goodbye to him. The next day, he passed away. His crime was trying to protect the aid from coming in so it could be distributed appropriately. In all my time when I lived there, working in the hospitals in Gaza, I never once saw Hamas fighters or weapons in the hospital. The only people we treated were civilians. The rhetoric the Israeli government uses to justify bombings is unwarranted, untrue, and a downright crime. With my testimony today, I would like to call to action. We must stop arming the Israeli government. We must place sanctions on them in order to stop this mass murder of innocent children. Starvation should never be used as a weapon. There must be a permanent and sustained ceasefire and unlimited aid allowed to enter. We must not forcibly displace the people of Gaza, but empower them to heal and repair their own state. It is difficult for me to criticize other countries when my own government is overwhelmingly enabling these crimes. Past US presidents have had courage to stop arms to Israel when it was unjustly bombing other countries. And I call on my own president, President Trump, to do the same. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mimi Syed. This has been a very difficult panel. Thank you all for your courage. So I think we will have maybe 10 minutes or so for questions. I would like to take a round of questions. So if you have a question, after you breathe a little bit. Yes, please.
Test. Can anyone hear me? Up until now, I've come late, but I have heard of one of the best ways to help was the Hind Rajab Foundation, where they're actively finding the soldiers and making them accountable through posts that they've themselves sent to the media. I wanted to ask, especially now with these two witness accounts stating that any support aid trying to come in is being held up at the border, any other way to help? Because this seems like a situation where we can't do anything other than speak, and it doesn't seem to.
It's working.
We can't do anything other than speak about this, inform others, but in the end it seems like, as you mentioned, please Trump do something, it seems like corruption is at an all-time high. What could we as people do other than just speak?
One more question. So I want to ask any of the panelists if they would like to take it. Decades ago, there used to be, at least on radical and left circles, a concept of praxis, in which there is an amalgam of expertise and the usage of expertise for human flourishing, for liberation, rather than perhaps the dominant perspective of the neoliberal professionalized subject that we have today in academia, perhaps also in medicine. Obviously, all of you here on this panel are ones who use this expertise for human freedom, for minimizing human suffering. So I wanted to, hear from your thoughts about your conception of your own practice, whether it's medicine or legal scholarship or, interventions in the public sphere. How you do that, why you do that, and so on and so forth. I don't know if Heidi would like to start.
The organizers remembered everything, but no?
It
Yes?
is.
Oh, you literally have to, okay. It's not a COVID-safe microphone. The organizers forgot boxes of tissues up here, I think, because we're all sort of, anyway, I'm not, a bit verklempt, but having this discussion for a while. Yeah, well, in terms of what you can do, I mean, I get, part of it depends. So if especially if one is from, I mean, all countries obviously, but if one is from a state in the global west, north, or whatever, who is in one way or another complicit in this, I mean, you can be politically active, right? So I get to know your representatives and really bother them a lot. Get involved in like whatever sorts of direct action you feel comfortable with, but being politically active is something I think that's available to everybody, and you know, can feel futile, but is kind of the root of existing in society. And I think part of, in terms of my own like as a professor, pedagogically, that's how I think of my own work too, is sort of helping students to become politically agentic people in the world, right? So as law students, those are the people I teach, not thinking of law in terms of apolitical professional identity, but directly in terms of political agency, you know, whatever that may mean for them. And that's actually something that I should say, especially in light of the last 19 months, in my own experience is treated with an increasing, like that general kind of attitude toward praxis and political life is treated increasingly with suspicion, especially in places, you're right, Nimr, that we would have previously thought of as left or progressive in some loose way. You know, recently I watched colleagues have a discussion about, you know, law students are starting to feel increasingly like beleaguered and pessimistic with the world, and you know, that's not good for their learning outcomes. So how can we help them to feel more optimistic? This was a literal discussion that was like took place, and yeah, and so I responded with, well, maybe we should help them be politically responsible people, and so yeah, I think we have to be really, and the way in which those kinds of discussions happen is quite coded, right? Like it's not even always easy to recognize when it's happening in our professional sphere. So I think so just being able to be attuned to that and ready to intervene to disrupt those moments of like stabilization of the, whatever you beautifully described as the, yeah, apolitical liberal professional, whatever, because it's all around us, so yeah.
So, first of all, I wanted to be a doctor when I was growing up, and thank God for all patients everywhere. That did not happen, but I just want to say I wanted to be a doctor because I wanted to be like the two of you. So, thank you so much. Okay, so I'm not a doctor, so I can't do what they do. But, you know, I hear you on just talking. What is talking? It doesn't feel like anything, really. But where I come from, unfortunately, talking about this stuff is meaningful. Because, and I come from the U.S., where if you speak about Palestine publicly, if you teach about Palestine, if you write about Palestine, there is an entire ecosystem at the private level, at the public level, at the very top of government that could potentially target you if you are on a visa, could deport you, could arrest you. And so while talking still isn't enough, even in those circumstances, it is so vital in places where talking is prohibited. And those are oftentimes the places that are the most complicit and the most responsible for what is happening inside Gaza and inside Palestine. That I encourage us not to think of talking as not worthwhile. When you don't have a lot of other tools at your disposal, certainly you shouldn't do nothing, right? And so at the very least, we should speak. At the very least, we should speak out. in terms of my own work, and this is just really to echo what Heidi said, there is still surprisingly so much apathy. So much, I don't even want to say lack of information, because the information is there. People just don't care. And they don't want their comfortable lives disturbed by conversations about what's happening in Gaza. That to them is a form of violence to their own lives, to their own stability, to their own comfort. And so I think what we can and should do, and certainly as educators we must do, is not allow for that comfort to just go undisturbed. People should be uncomfortable. There should not be a moment of comfort for anyone, anywhere, certainly not in the United States. So I think of my own work, whether it's writing or speaking or whatever, especially in the United States, as being an opportunity for me to refuse to allow those around me who could otherwise avoid this topic to not be able to avoid the topic. Again, it's not enough, but it is at bottom, I think, what we need to be doing, certainly as lawyers, certainly as people behind the podium. And the Hind Rajab Foundation also potentially has an opportunity in the United States to go after those security companies who are supposed to be providing the assistance and support to this Gaza Humanitarian Fund, and to go back once more to speaking, and potentially to the threat of litigation. The director, the executive director of the Gaza Humanitarian whatever bullshit in Switzerland just resigned. This was an ex-army officer, I think a sniper, a Marine, who said, this organization cannot actually be compliant with the rules of international humanitarian law, so I am resigning. It's not, again, enough, but it's really important.
Yeah, I actually want to make a brief comment. I also have a question that I would love for specifically something you mentioned, Maryam. So, one thing we've noticed and we can say is that the medical field in the United States has been a disaster in terms of the censorship and the double standard and the hypocrisy. I remember the American Medical Association specifically called Ukrainian healthcare workers heroes for their response, and then somehow when it comes to Gaza, not even a single statement, not even calling for a ceasefire, not acknowledging what our colleagues on the ground in Gaza are doing with so little. So we're trying to work to fight that, and I've had, my academic side is as an assistant clinical professor, I'm trying to academic promotion. I've had, it's very important for us to do something called grand rounds, where we'll broach, literally you're supposed to broach controversial subjects in medicine. And I've had 2 talks about Gaza canceled within days of them supposed to happen. So it's clear the environment is very stifling at this point. I think for us, these organizations, professional societies, there seems to be like a popular mandate growing, but the leadership is not reflecting that. Even in the United States, the American Historical Association overwhelmingly voted labeling what was happening in Gaza as a genocide, and then somehow the board of directors decides not to issue a condemnation or a statement reflecting what the popular mandate shows. So I think that's one thing we need to work on is, these organizations, these societies, they need to be held to account. They need to not just have these values that they write on their mission statements, but they need to demonstrate these values.
How do you do that?
Yeah, I think for me, it's very simple. What did you do in Ukraine? What did you do for Ukraine? You raised money through humanitarian organizations. You helped highlight the plight of what was happening in Ukraine. You worked to amplify the human narratives. Why are you not doing that in Gaza? Why are you not doing that in Palestine? How come when you get to the border, that stops? Do that at least. Be consistent. Can you be morally consistent? That's all you need to do. And I think the way that we do that, how we hold them accountable, is we say, hey, you care about our membership dues, you care about us, well, we're going to cancel it. And so that's what we're working on. We're working to organize that. It should have been there already, but this woke, I think, everybody up. My question is, when we came back, we had to put on the role of working in this advocacy space. And not just our testimony, but we had to have asks for lawmakers, people, National Security Council, State Department. One thing that came up in your lecture specifically was something that was told to me directly by Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor. He literally said, the Israelis are telling us that this commander that they killed in Jabalia, that over 100 civilians were killed in the process, that his risk profile for Israeli citizens is much higher than that, thus justifying it. And the constant thing that we hear from the State Department when we're trying to amplify issues is bring us individual cases, bring us individual cases. And I think you brought up how, you know, if you take it from a bird's eye view, the Israelis can justify anything. And so I guess, how do we respond to that as we're moving forward, trying to bring this up? If once they're done talking, we can maybe come back.
Yeah, I don't have that much more to add, but I think, you know, your question is relative to where you're asking from, what country you're asking from, right? In the United States, and we all know the elephant in the room, if the United States wants, tomorrow this ends, right? And so the pressure needs to be on our country, unfortunately. And some of the things that, you know, Maryam is talking about, having the conversation, that is the biggest part of what I realized when I came back, is giving people the tool to have conversations, because a lot of this is ignorance, unfortunately, and people don't have confidence to have this conversation. They think it's too complicated. They don't know enough about the issue or the conflict, so they don't feel comfortable having the conversation. And so just simply educating people and giving them the tools, the narrative, the vocabulary. The vocabulary sometimes is the most important thing you can provide somebody, is how to talk about it. And that's, you know, and I'm speaking from a kind of American perspective, but that's who needs to be convinced, unfortunately. You guys don't need to be convinced.
No,
Yeah.
I just want to say,
It's,
Paul says 70% now, so it's not ignorance. If 70% no longer sees Israel as legitimate, it's just more than just ignorance.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. At this point, yes. But even so, you know, even if they're not ignorant, they still don't have the confidence to talk about it, because there is a lot of history involved. There's a lot of education that does need to be had, because people, they only know what they're indoctrinated with in the United States. And I'll tell you, and both of us, we were born in the United States, so we know what the school system and the education system indoctrinates in you. And that's what the product that you see in the United States, the citizens, that's what they talk about. So we need to give them a new language to talk about it, is kind of my point.
And I think the talk is important, because but it's only the starting point. In the end, we need to shift the political will to action. That those words have to be the foundation through which action is called for. And the work that we do engaging these legal mechanisms, they don't operate on their own. We have to force them to move these wheels of justice. That's all we can do from our particular part in this bigger ecosystem. But through this engagement, we expose other things. And I think seeing our roles as part of a bigger ecosystem is very important, because in the end, all of it needs to be pushing towards action. What we have seen, basically things stop at a call for, but that still is waiting for someone else to heed that call. And I think after these last 19 months, it's also time for us to think about escalating what it is that we are calling for. If we are calling for sanctions and they're not being imposed, if we are calling for an arms embargo and it's not being imposed, we've seen civil society try to organize a flotilla that was targeted as well. Now we've seen important rhetoric coming from countries like Spain and France about the importance of delivering aid. Well, maybe we need to escalate our call and call on them to take the action necessary and bring the aid directly and potentially put themselves in conflict with the Israeli position, but an armada of aid coming, using their naval ships to deliver the aid, also falls within the justification of international law, ensuring compliance with international humanitarian law, the responsibility to protect. All of these things allow for states to take action if there's a political will to do so. But in order for them to take that step, there needs to be pressure that comes from the individuals, the public, civil society, and other actors that hopefully will lead them to take such an action.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we have to end it here. We will move immediately to the next session, to the grand finale, to the creme de la creme. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for this wonderful and very depressing panel.